It was in the early hours of Sunday the 29th of August 1948 that the lifeless body of a 68-year-old lady will be discovered laying outside number 137 Bacup Road. But who was this lady, and why was her murder so controversial in 1948? This, my friends, is the story of two people, that being of Nancy Ellen Chadwick herself and also of her murderer, Margaret Allen, also known as Bill. Nancy Ellen Barnes. She was born on the 10th of August 1880 to parents George and Francis, and she was the second of 6 children to be born into the family. She lived in Aslington for many years before relocating to nearby Rawtenstall. Now, as the years went by, she became a house cleaner for a Mr. John Crabtree. And John Crabtree was also a wealthy landowner. He had many properties in and around Rawtenstall. When Crabtree himself passed away, he would leave Nancy 4 apartments, 4 houses. And from these houses, Nancy would make a considerable amount of money through rent. She was a wealthy lady from all accounts, and she was always seen with money in her possession. She wasn't one for showing off her wealth. In fact, it was the opposite. Nancy would always be seen dressed in scruffy attire, second-hand clothes. She always looked unkempt. But it's in far contrast to what she once looked like when she was much younger. And we do have one photo of Nancy in her younger years. And as you can see, she does look quite a respectable, good-looking young lady. But in her later years, and to 1948, and when her death took place, her murder took place, she becomes somewhat of a bitter, cantankerous old lady. From all accounts, not many people warmed to her. She could be quite abrupt and rude with people. Even her nephew, William Barnes, would tell at the later inquest into her death that she would call upon strangers. She would knock on strangers' doors. She would invite herself in for a cup of tea, sometimes for a meal. But while she was there, she would also read their fortunes using the tea leaves from the tea that they made her. She was quite miserly, from all accounts, with her money. And even though she had these premises, these properties where she was bringing in a substantial amount of money through the rents, it was only when she was really pushed to do maintenance work, that is when she would get the money out and to pay for these jobs to be done. At the time of Nancy's death, Nancy herself was a housekeeper for an elderly gentleman called Edward Whittaker. I think he was about 81 years old at the time. But he had ill health, and she became friendly with Edward and, like I said, become his housekeeper, his house cleaner. She'd do all the chores, make his meals. She would basically look after him. But they'd become very friendly. Not a couple, nothing like that, but Edward relied on Nancy. And it seems that Nancy had a lot of respect for Edward as well. So out of all the people in and around Rawtenstall and Rosendale, Nancy had that one friend, and that was Edward. Now we'll come back to Edward towards the end of this tragic story, because there is a twist to it, and it's a sad twist at that, but we will come back to that shortly. Now, as for Margaret Allen, who is she and what role does she play in today's story? Margaret Allen, she was born in September 1906, and some reports have her being born over in Bolton, but we can't find any proof of that just yet. However, we do know she was living with her family in Plantation Street, which isn't too far from where she would soon move to on 137 Bacup Road. Throughout her early life, she had it tough. She really had it tough. She would always be in the mills, or she could well be at school. She was a half-timer, you see, and half-timers, they would spend half a day at school, half a day at work. She worked from the age of 12. In her younger years, teens, 20s, she would begin suffering from a lot of ill health. She would be seen in and out of local doctors. And the reason for ill health would vary. But as she got into her 20s, 30s and early 40s, a lot of that ill health would come from stomach cramps, menstrual problems. And in 1935, she would visit St Mary's Hospital in Manchester for an operation. Upon her release, and when she came back to Rawtenstall, she would tell people that she had had the change. She had had a sex change. Now, whether or not people believed it, we're unsure. I think quite a lot of people didn't believe it, but again, we can't really prove that. Maggie at this time would always be seen wearing men's clothes. She would always act in a manly way. She would be seen in the local pubs, drinking Guinness, mild. She'd be playing darts, dominoes, cards. She'd be doing all the things that a male would be doing. From reading some historical records, the newspaper articles, it appears that Maggie had started to wear men's clothing. It was way before the outset of the Second World War. But in 1939, and we do have a photo of this, she would join the ARP, or the Air Raid Precautions Unit. In other words, the Home Guard. And we do have a photo of her wearing that uniform. And in that photograph, you will see she does have quite a manly stature about her, a manly look about her. Now, Maggie, upon leaving hospital back in 1935 and returning to Rawtenstall, she would go around telling people she would no longer respond to the name Margaret or Maggie. She was now known, or wanted to be known and called, Bill. Now, in today's society, and obviously the years have gone by, there's a lot more education out there when it comes to transgender. Now, I'm not going to profess to know anything about transgender, the life, the operations, things like that that people go through. But from now on in this story, we're going to refer to Margaret as Bill, and we're going to refer to Bill, obviously, as being he or him. So if you're wondering who Bill is and why I'm saying he or him, it is because from 1935 up until 1948, obviously Margaret had had the operation. She was telling people that she was now a man. We're going to respect Bill's wishes and refer to him as a man in that terminology. Now, obviously, during the war, with all the men, the young boys being abroad fighting, it was left to the women to continue doing everyday job in the mills, on the buses, etc. And this is exactly what Bill would do. He got a job as a conductor working for the Rawtenstall Bus Corporation. However, upon the end of the war, Bill lost his job working for that corporation, and he was accused of theft. Now, Bill left mutually at that point, and no other further investigation took place, but this left Bill with severe debts. He had a mountain of debts to pay. He had no income. He was struggling financially. Now, at this point in his life, and from around 1946, Bill had met the acquaintance of a young woman, 10 years younger, by the name of Annie Cook. Now, Annie Cook, from all accounts, was a good-looking young woman, and I wouldn't say she was wealthy, but she did have a better standing in life. And this could be one motive behind the killing of Nancy, but we'll get to that shortly. Now, this companionship, this friendship he had with Annie Cook would stand the test of time, even in death. Annie Cook had been married, but her husband went to fight in the war, but he'd only been gone for a few weeks before returning home. But something transpired, and Annie and her husband just did not get along anymore. Annie filed for a divorce, which she would get. Now, Bill obviously knew of Annie's past. She would have told him all this. But that wouldn't stop Bill and Annie becoming extremely close friends. So close, in fact, many of Annie's own family would often think and often talk about their daughter and Bill being a couple. There is one article, and Annie herself testified to this whilst the inquest into the murder of Nancy Chadwick was going on, in that Bill and Annie themselves went over to Blackpool. They went for a weekend break during, I think it was Whitsuntide or Whitsunside event, and Bill signed the couple in as Mr. Allen. Annie at the inquest would also mention that Bill had asked if they could become close. He came out with a remark to which Annie refused. She didn't want anything of a sexual or close encounter with Bill at this point. Now, many people have covered this same story as myself and Vicky and wrongly said that Annie and Bill would fall out over the incident that took place in Blackpool, where Bill asked Annie for a little bit more. Now, we know that that meant he wanted to sleep with Annie, but Annie refused. They didn't fall out over this. She just simply refused. Annie and Bill, you see, were extremely close friends. Now, her family would later say that they always presumed they were a couple, and perhaps they were, because Annie, after all, would say that they had slept in the same bed at Bill's house at least 3 times, but nothing untoward happened. Both were fully clothed at the time in nightwear. Now, obviously, Annie could be saying this because of the time period we're in, the 1940s. You know, a gay relationship, a lesbian relationship was frowned upon. There was a lot of hostility between people and the gay community. So I can understand why Annie probably would deny any sexual encounters with Bill. I'm not saying it happened, I'm not going to say it didn't happen, but I can understand why she may have lied about it not happening if it was happening, if that makes sense. But yeah, a lot of people have kind of insinuated that Bill and Annie fell out big time over the Blackpool affair, and nothing of the kind ever happened. And Annie was the only friend that Bill had up and even after his death in 1949. She was the one that was supporting through the court ordeal, being in prison. She was the one that would go to Strange Ways to speak to Bill before his execution. This then brings us to the links between Nancy Chadwick and Margaret Allen and how they first met. Margaret at this point was now being known as Bill, and it was through an acquaintance that Nancy and Bill had become, I won't say friends, but they started to see each other on a regular basis, 2 or 3 times a week leading up to the death of Nancy. And Bill had offered a kind gesture by offering to supply Nancy with sugar or any other necessities that she may need. We could possibly interpret that as seeing Bill looking on at Nancy as being somewhat destitute, poor. Bill may not have known the history of Nancy and the fact that Nancy was a wealthy lady. It's hard to know, but we know Bill would offer at least sugar and other basic essentials. Now, on Saturday the 28th of August 1948, Nancy made a visit to Bill's house at 137 Bacup Road. Bill was leaving when Nancy arrived at the door. Now, Nancy, from all accounts, was quite pushy in her manner, and she kept eyeing Bill. Oh, let me in, let me in, let me have a look around. Now, whether or not Bill was embarrassed about the state of his home, again, it's just conjecture, we will never know. But eventually, Bill gave in and he allowed Nancy into his house. Bill would tell the police that things transpired out of hand. Nancy was going on at him about whatever, you know, just probably about the state of this house, we don't know. But sure, Bill would tell the police that he simply snapped. He picked up an hammer that he found in the kitchen and he began to hit Nancy over the head at least a dozen times. He carried on hitting Nancy simply because Nancy shouted out after the first strike, and Bill would tell the police that at that point he'd had enough and he was in one of his funny moods. Now, the funny moods, Bill struggled, as I was saying, with ill health, but he also struggled with severe headaches. Onset of headaches could be instant. Sometimes they'd last 30 minutes, sometimes they'd last a lot longer, hours if not days. But these headaches always put Bill into one of his funny moods, and Annie herself at the upcoming inquest would talk about the funny moods, the strange moods that Bill would have sometimes when he and Annie were together. Now, after killing poor Nancy Chadwick, Bill hid her body in the coal cellar that was just at the side of Bill's house, and then he went to sleep. He was asleep for a few hours, but he was kept awake, he kept waking up, I should say, because of the thoughts running through his head and what he had done. He then went to take the body of Nancy out to dispose of her into the River Irwell. The body was too heavy, so instead Bill simply dragged Nancy's body out and placed her onto the main road, Bacup Road, directly outside his own home. The discovery of this poor lady and the body lying in the road was made by a bus driver by the name of Herbert Beaumont, and he was taking fellow colleagues from the Rawtenstall bus depot from Rawtenstall to Bacup on the bus. But 30 minutes prior to that, other workers had made their way by foot along that stretch of road, and there was no body on the floor at that time, or on the ground at that time. So within 30 minutes, it seemed an accident had occurred, and this person may have been struck by a passing vehicle. However, Herbert himself inspected the body, and he would tell colleagues this body hadn't been hit by a motor vehicle because of the condition of the head. The head had been pretty much caved in. It was like the body had been placed there purposefully. Now, the body of Nancy Chadwick was discovered by the busmen lying roughly here in the road, and we do have photographs from the crime scene to back that up. And as you'll see from other photographs, the police officers are looking down at that grid. Now, that grid, and again when we line up the shots, does tie up with this area here, which would have been Maggie Allen's home at 137 Bacup Road. Now, the home itself, the building, would have been all along this stretch here, and it's long since been demolished, and what you've got behind it is the old weaver's cottage. Now, the coal cellar, or the coal shed, if we go down to this angle, We do have a photograph showing Nancy, or where Nancy's body was taken after she was killed. And she was taken into the coal cellar, and there's a door which is about here, and you will see the black mass, the black shadow of the coal cellar itself, and it is in there where the body of Nancy was hidden. From this angle you can see just how small Bill's house would have been back in 1948. It would have been attached to this side of the weaver's cottage, and it would have spread out roughly to where my hand is now, round about here. It was very, very tiny. The coal cellar would have been, again, just where I'm pointing, and that, like I said, is where Bill placed the body of Nancy after he had killed her. Now, Bill would tell police, and again, this is his own words, that he was going to dispose of Nancy's body by placing her over into the River Irwell. But the body was too heavy, so instead he dragged Nancy's body from the coal cellar and placed it onto the main road just there. It was shortly after the discovery of the body that the coroner came over, and after looking at Nancy, he ordered her body to be brought over to this side of the road itself. Why he did that without the police cordoning it off, we don't know. But 137 Bacup Road, the house, would have been just here, with the body of Nancy lying in the road just somewhere in that area, and we will put arrows over. And as you can see, it would have been very, very tiny, one of the smallest houses perhaps on this road itself. There were other houses down here at the time, again it's all gone. But just in front of the weaver's cottage, like I said, was 137 Bacup Road, and the former home of Maggie Allen. Now that former home was also once a police station, and I think it just had the 2 rooms as well as the cellar. Now at this point, and upon the discovery of Nancy Chadwick's body, Bill would kind of go about his business in his own little way. Later that morning, on the 29th of August, he met with Annie Cook, and together they went over to the Ashworth Arms, which is probably a 5-minute walk away from where we are today. But he was acting out of character, he was acting giddy, and he kept staring at Annie Cook, and she would later tell at the upcoming inquest and the court proceedings that he just seemed to be on edge. Something obviously was at the back of his mind. Now obviously that would have been probably just a human reflex, it's just a way of trying to cope with knowing what one had done. And in Bill's case, obviously, he'd taken the life of poor Nancy. Now the police themselves, throughout that day, they would do the investigations, they cordoned the area off, and by 8 o'clock Nancy's body was transferred over to the nearby mortuary. Later that afternoon, a bloodhound by the name of Lubin was called for. Lubin was given a hat and some other clothing belonging to Nancy herself. It took the scent. Now this scent would take the dog and its owner over to the River Irwell, where an important discovery would be made. But it's also that discovery which Bill himself would kind of implicit himself in the murder of Nancy Chadwick. One interesting aspect of the story, and it revolves around the murder weapon, and it was an hammer that was used to kill Nancy Chadwick. Now Bill told the police when he was being interviewed that where the bag was discovered, which is just further on along that direction, the hammerhead itself, Bill had snapped off the wooden handle, and he walked a couple of 100 yards from where the bag was found before throwing it here into the River Irwell. Now from what I gather, I honestly don't think that hammerhead was ever discovered, so it could effectively well still be somewhere along this stretch. That murder weapon could still technically be here in this water. The handle itself, however, Bill put into the fireplace and he burnt it. Now I can only assume he did that to destroy the evidence, because it would have been matted with blood and possibly hair from Nancy, and obviously that was enough proof for the police. So you could argue and say this was a calculated afterthought, if there's such a word. After all, Bill didn't plan to kill Nancy on the 28th, on Saturday the 28th. Things obviously transpired and it obviously led to the death of Nancy. But it was after, the afterthought, when I think Bill kind of meticulously planned what he was going to do. Like I said, the hammerhead is somewhere, or was somewhere, thrown here in the air well. The handle was burnt. Bill was seen stood somewhere close to where we are now, along with several other curious bystanders. And once Lubin the Bloodhound had brought, like I said, its owner to this location, Bill was the first person to alert the police to noticing an object in the water itself, or close to the water's edge. Nobody else mentioned it other than Bill. So straight away, this kind of perked the curiosity of the police, and they were sensing something quite wasn't right with this person. At this time, obviously, they just went to go and look at what this object was. Now, we do have a photograph of a police officer clambering down and then back up, obviously, the ladders, and in his hand he is holding that object. Now, this object, it would turn out to be the handbag that Nancy had owned. Now, when they searched the contents, they found a few personal belongings, but they never found any money. Now, this is important in this story because we know factually Nancy always carried a large amount of money wherever she went. She didn't trust banks. The handbag itself was empty of money. Personal belongings, yes. Money, no. This, therefore, would make the police assume that her death was a robbery. Maybe that had gone wrong, but the motive was indeed robbery at this point. Obviously, over the years, things have changed, and the railway bridge, the footpath is long gone. The railway itself has since disappeared. But just in the distance, just over there, is Weaver's Cottage, and it would have been in front of that building where Bill's house once stood, 137 Bacup Road, and obviously there where Nancy herself was killed. So it wasn't that much of a travel or a distance for Bill if he wanted to dispose of Nancy's body here in the River Irwell. But like he would say at a later date, the body was just too heavy. But it is interesting that some of the features from that period, 1948, are still here. The wall, obviously the River Irwell's not changed. You do have this bridge, which is more modern, but it's just here where the police officers stood and where one of the officers went down to collect and to pick up that handbag that once belonged to Nancy Chadwick. With Bill becoming the focal point now, being the spokesperson, if you could say, of the local people. After all, he did point out this bag, this object in the River Irwell. He was the only person to do so. The police had become a little bit curious as to who this person was. On the 31st of August, he would be taken in for questioning. Now, Bill, as we know, was a keen frequenter of all the local public houses in and around Rawtenstall. And it seems that he began speaking a little bit too much about the case and about the murder of Nancy Chadwick. And within a day or two of Nancy's body being found, Bill would go into one of these public houses and come out with a comment based on being the last person to see Nancy Chadwick alive. Now, this obviously raised the suspicions of several people. There were some journalists in one of these public houses, and obviously the journalists were now curious as to this comment. Before long, the police were informed, and they would soon be knocking on Bill's front door. Now, it would emerge that when Bill was being questioned by the police at her house at 137 Baker Road, they found in a cupboard in the living room another shopping bag full of fire grate ashes and 3 pieces of a rag, 2 dry and 1 being wet. Now, under caution, Allen told them to use the wet rag as a floor swab. When questioned further about the wet rag, Allen had said, "Come on, I'll tell you all about it," and pointed to the coal cellar. She said, "That's where I put her." Now, bloodstains were found near the door of the coal cellar, and when asked by Detective Inspector Stevens why they were there, Allen didn't answer. But when charged with murder, Allen said, "I did it." The ashes in the bag were found to be saturated with human blood, and there had also been found similar hair to Nancy Chadwick. On Thursday, the 2nd of September 1948, and after being charged for the murder of Nancy Chadwick, Bill would make an appearance at the Rawtenstall Magistrates' Courts. But at least an hour and a half before the doors opened, a long queue had formed outside, mainly that of women. The funeral of Nancy Chadwick took place here in Rawtenstall Cemetery on the 2nd of September 1948, so just a few days after her body was found lifeless over on Bacup Road. Only a dozen or so people attended that funeral, which was quite strange considering 1, her age, and 2, the severity of her death and how she was murdered. It was shocking, it was barbaric, it made all the news. Normally in cases like this, and ones that myself and Vicky have researched and covered in the past, you do hear stories of hundreds if not thousands of people coming out to pay the final respects, lining the streets, visiting the cemetery and the churchyards hours before the services were set to take place. But yet in this case, only a dozen or so people showed any interest, and 2 of those people who were in the dozen or so, they were police officers. So the turnout was extremely poor, if not sad. Nancy Chadwick lies just here in grave 1259. And as you can see, apart from this modern stone here, not like all the old headstones, there's nothing much to remember her by. And it's sad, and it's another story yet again where there's no official headstone. But we do know she's here because that headstone is 1260. You've got 59, 58, and behind that one is 57, 1257. So this is the final resting place of Nancy Ellen Chadwick, murdered sometime on the 28th of August 1948. On the 23rd of September, Bill would make his 4th appearance in court, and this time the details of what occurred on the 28th and 29th of August would finally be revealed. Nancy's whereabouts, how she was found, the condition she was found in, and how her head had been caved in would be grimly detailed. Now, a lot of this is in the public domain, it's in the newspaper articles, but it is quite extensive, so we're not going to go through it all here for this video. One thing we can add to the court appearance on the 23rd was Bill himself showed no remorse, no emotion whatsoever, and he only said 2 things, and that was to 2 questions. He would reply, "No, sir," when asked if he had anything to say, and he would also say, "I do not wish to say anything," to another question. So on the 23rd of September, Bill had the opportunity to put his case forward. But a lot of people have written since, all stating the same thing, and that Bill himself didn't realise the situation he was in and to the seriousness of that situation and what it would ultimately mean to his own life if his appearance in court went against him. Obviously, we're talking about a guilty verdict being placed upon him and obviously this sentence of death. But yet Bill seemed to be so far away from believing that could happen to him. He showed no remorse, no emotion. He wouldn't defend himself. His defence team, on the other hand, would try to go down the road of insanity. On Wednesday, the 8th of December 1948, Bill would make an appearance at the Manchester Assizes charged with the willful murder of Nancy Chadwick. A jury of 9 men and 3 women would spend 5 hours listening to and reading all of the evidence as well as the witness testimonies. But it would only take them 16 minutes to come to their verdicts of guilty of murder. So the judge had no option but to pass down the sentence of death by hanging. And it was on Wednesday, the 12th of January 1949, when that execution would take place. Now, as the sentence of death was passed down and Bill was now facing the prospect of hanging, a petition by his close friend Annie Cook was quickly instigated. Annie would leave work and spend the next 2 days trying to raise as many signatures as possible. Out of a town which roughly had about 16,000 people living in, she received around 100 signatures, if not less. People were interested. And it's strange because even though a dozen or so, that's all, people would attend the funeral of Nancy herself, people were interested in Bill's side of the story. Only 100 or so people would sign this petition. Eventually that would grow to 362 people or signatures, but it wasn't enough to convince the Home Office to reject the death sentence and to maybe give Bill life imprisonment instead, to reduce that sentence. So what was going on with the public? Nobody showed any interest in Nancy's funeral and nobody showed interest in trying to help Bill. So what was going on? I can only think it's because of the circumstances Bill found himself in throughout the years. Dressing as a man, talking as a man, working as a man, acting like a man. Were people feeling uncomfortable because of this person? The records don't seem to show this, the newspapers don't seem to talk about this, but was there a subtle ignorance into people and how they perceived Bill back in 1948 and the years before that? Again, we don't know, but it does seem strange how signatures could not be found. People weren't willing to sign this appeal. Just over, like I said, 100 people, which then grew to 300. It seems really, really strange, and especially out of a town which contains so many thousand people. On the morning of Bill's execution at Strangeways, her closest friend Annie Cook would travel to what is still today known as K Street, and it joins along Bacup Road. And she went there for 9 o'clock and the time of the execution of Bill. She made a promise on the eve of the execution with Bill that she would wait for her here in Rawtenstall on that corner. You see, the bottom of K Street is where Bill and Annie would always meet every Saturday afternoon. Sometimes they'd meet during the evenings during the week, but it was always on the corner of K Street. It was their special place, it was their meeting point. It was a place that both of them knew fondly. So Annie, for 9 o'clock, was stood, like I said, on that corner, and we're going to go there now. She wept just as the bell would have rung at Strangeways by 9 o'clock, and by 10 past 9, and after the execution had taken place, Annie, she was still on the corner, weeping profusely, trying to make sense of it all. So this is where Annie and her sister Gladys, along with a few curious bystanders, would have stood, and it is just here on the corner of K Street. Bacup Road is this stretch here where Bill's house was located, just past the bus stop, just in the distance. So like I said, about 100 or so yards away. But it is here where Annie would stand on the 12th of January 1949 at around 9 o'clock that morning, when her friend Bill was being executed. 42 years after the execution of Margaret Allen, or Bill, in Strangeways Prison, her body, along with around 40 or 41 other executed criminals, will be exhumed from the grounds of Strangeways Prison. They would be brought here to Blackley Crematorium, and it's in 2 plots where the ashes of those convicted criminals are now laying, Margaret Allen being just one. And the plot numbers are C2710 and C2711. And it's just here in front of me where Margaret Allen, or Bill I should say, her ashes now lay. "12 blows to the head Nancy Chadwick suffered when Bill attacked her. In the eyes of the law, she was a murderer, or he was a murderer." Vicky, off camera, has quite rightly mentioned that during the court case, Bill was always referred to as Margaret Allen, never referred to as Bill. Now, we understand why, we believe, don't we? It's because of the birth certificate, and she was born a woman or a girl, female. It was only after 1935 Maggie wanted to be known as Bill. So the court, quite rightly, used her Christian name. 12 blows to the head. The court simply looked at this as downright murder, and she suffered the ultimate punishment, which was death by hanging. However, and I'll touch upon this quickly, I personally believe today, if hanging was still a thing, Maggie or Bill perhaps would have got life imprisonment, because more is now known on hormonal changes, women going through the change, sexualities, transgender, the pain that, like I said, the hormonal changes that Maggie were going through and suffering from. We know that she visited the doctors over 40 times within a 2-year period because of all these ailments. She was suffering immensely.
Emotionally as well.
Emotionally. She probably would have suffered from depression, solitude, because of her sexuality. She couldn't speak to anybody other than Annie Cook. People knew she was dressed, or she dressed and liked to dress in men's clothing. She acted like a man. She'd go drinking pints of Guinness. She'd drink mead. She'd play darts, dominoes, cards with other men. She always socialised with men. We know more now in 2024 than what they did in the 1940s. And this is why I believed she was found guilty with no plea of mercy. There was nothing to try to reduce the death penalty on poor Maggie. And I am saying poor Maggie because even though I'm not trying to condone what she did with Nancy Chadwick, murder is murder and she should have been punished. But considering all of what I've just mentioned, I personally believe that Maggie maybe at most have spent life imprisonment. But Vicky has another point, don't you? And you believe that Maggie deserved to be hung for what she did.
Yeah.
And that's based on all the facts.
Yeah.
And it's down to the fact that Vicky believes that 12 blows is more than what is excusable.
Yeah. If it would be 1, 2, yeah, I think possibly you could look at all the behind
What was
what's
going
going on with her, or him, as he likes to be called. No, 12 blows to me.
12 blows to the head. Was it that? Was it 12 blows to the head that convinced the jury that, no, there's no mercy bargaining, there's no plea, there's no insanity plea. Bill had to hang for what he did. It'd be interesting to know your comments down below on that. I've tried to word it best I can. I've tried to be sensitive as best I can, because obviously it's a tricky subject. It's a hard subject to talk about, and especially more so for the likes of myself and Vicky, who we don't really know anything about the transgender community and that side of life. So we hope we've done it sensitively. But I believe that Maggie, for me, perhaps should have probably spent life imprisonment and not hung for it. Vicky, on the other hand, thinks no, 12 blows to the head was more than sufficient for it not to be anything else but pure murder.
You see, even in today's society, if she had have had the defence backing her with all what you've just talked about, her emotional, what she was going through, ill health, the change, I still think the jury would, because of 12 blows, I think they would take it all on board. But I do think because it's 12 blows to that head.
Yeah, it is excessive. 12 blows to the head is excessive. But I would love to know your thoughts down below on this. Do you think Bill or Maggie should have received the death penalty, or perhaps maybe life imprisonment? 12 blows to the head, after all, is severe, and it is one that it was 11 blows too many. Comment down below and tell us your thoughts. So as I mentioned, the twist and the sad twist of this story is that of John Edward Whittaker, because it wasn't just one death that occurred during some time on the 28th of August and that of Nancy. There was 2 deaths, and 2 relatable deaths, because John and Nancy, like I said, they were good friends. She did everything for him, and it seems that you could argue and say, well, John was pretty much heartbroken and destroyed by the loss of his good friend, and he couldn't face the prospect of appearing in court and listening to the gory details and trying to make sense of it all. Now, he had threatened to take his own life several times before, apparently, and even one of his neighbours, Mrs. Jane McCulloch, she would say at a later interview in one of the papers that he himself had told her that he would be going out for a walk but may not return, and he said exactly the same on this one day in particular when he would take his own life. 2 weeks after the arrest of Maggie, John walked out of his home and crossed the fields at Hall Car. Less than a mile from his home there was a lodge, and it was there that John would drown himself. So that is all from Rawtenstall Cemetery, and we do hope you've enjoyed this dark, if not morbid, story. It's a tragic one, and it's another violent one, and it's one that should never have occurred back in 1948. Do you believe Bill should have hung for the murder of Nancy Chadwick? I personally don't believe he should have done. Vicky, on the other hand, says yes, eye for an eye. Tell us your thoughts down below. It'd be interesting to know. Now, in the meantime, if you could please share this video or subscribe to the channel, it would mean the world to us. We do read every comment that is left with the videos. We don't necessarily always reply to them all because there's so many. It's not that we're ignoring you guys. Trust us, we do read everyone. If we can't reply to everyone, we will at least give a love heart, a little thumbs up, so you know we have read it. But like I said, guys, the channel's growing and we are getting inundated, aren't we? Inundated with a lot of comments. So please don't be offended if we fail to reply to anybody in particular. We don't mean to. But in the meantime, guys, if you could do those things, if you can comment, subscribe, share the video, it would mean the world. But in the meantime, as you always say, I want you to stay safe, stay curious, and we will be back soon with more tales from a dark, but at times glorious past. So take care, everybody.